Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all very much for being here this evening. I'm Christian Jenkins. I'm the Executive Director of the Page Research Centre, and I do want to extend you all warm and hearty thanks, because many of us have had to battle through borders and barriers and various belligerent premiers to be here, so it's commendable, so thank you all. I'll just take this brief moment, if I may, to do a quick plug, and that is please buy the book Cancel Culture and the Left's Long March, which is available for sale outside there. Peta Credlin was good enough to write the foreword for that book, so thank you for that, Peter. And Dr. Kevin Donnelly, who's waving his arms around at the back there, is the editor, so that's available if you'd like. I'll just thank key people. First of all, I'd like to thank Stephen Ferguson, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the National One of Australia Hotels Association, and indeed his colleague Julian Sheasel, who's with Carlton and United Breweries. They've made this event possible, and their generosity is most welcome and we're very warmly grateful for it. Thank you, Stephen. I'll acknowledge and thank the Page directors, and I'll name them, those that are here. Not all of them are here, that's the board of directors, but Andrew Black is here. Thank you, Andrew. As is Graham Lavis and Martin Sfiggis. And the Honourable Bill Baxter, he's here too, somewhere, although I can't see him. And of course, the Honourable John Anderson, who's our chair. So thank you all for your support and your leadership and for being here. Also like to thank and acknowledge the various politicians and senators who are here, many of whom have come down from Canberra today, and they've had quite a couple of weeks, as Bridget told me earlier. So I'll thank the senators, the Honourable Bridget McKenzie and the Honourable Matthew Canavan. Thank you both. I'll also thank, if I can spot him, Damien Drum MP. And let's give him a big round of applause, because as most of you obviously already know, he announced that he won't be running at the next election. So thank you, Damien, for everything, and indeed for being here also tonight. Thank you to Dr. Anne Webster MP, and also the Honourable Peter Walsh, who, as most people here will know, is the leader of the Victorian Nationals, and his colleague Melina Barth is here too. So thank you to all the politicians, and thank you to Matthew Harris, who's the State Director down here. He and his team, including Brooke, have been very generous with their time and resources and have been a great help in putting this on, so I'd like to thank and acknowledge them. And also Jonathan Hawkes, who's the Federal Director. He and our team in Canberra must be thanked. But above all, if I could, I'd like to thank, and I'm going to use a fancy adjective here, the indomitable Peta Credlin for agreeing to deliver our annual lecture this year. And I say indomitable, and I think it probably is an accurate description of her, because as many of us have seen throughout this pandemic, she's very willing and indeed able to speak truth to power, as she's persistently done to the Andrews government throughout this period. And it's commendable in particular because so many of the other mainstream media outfits are reluctant to do so for their own reasons. So the indomitable Peta Credlin, I want to thank above all. I mean, she stands for common sense, conservative principles in the face of what is often, I would imagine, relentless attack. And most commendably, arguably of all, is the fact that she won't be cowed into compliance with whatever the prevailing cultural view happens to be at any given moment, if she doesn't agree with it. And for that, we must thank her and encourage her. But I'll leave the fuller introduction to Peter to our chairman, John Anderson, who will come up in a moment. Before I do, though, just to note that after Peter has finished speaking, the Honourable Bridget McKenzie will say a few words and close out the evening. But thank you all, and please join me in welcoming our chairman, the Honourable John Anderson.
Great honour to be here tonight, and a particular joy to welcome and introduce Peta Credlin. Before I do that, can I acknowledge Peter Walsh? Thank you for having us in your territory. Thank you too to the Victorian members. Damien over there, and Matt, who is from Queensland and is, in fact, a director, and Bridget, a former director on the page board. Great to have you. And I think I've missed someone. And Anne Webster is over there in that terrific green. I shouldn't have missed you. It's good to see you. And friends one and all. Peter and I managed at least one piece of brilliance in our respective lives. We chose our parents well. They were not only Australians, they were regional Australians. In my case, from a little place called Malali, in your case, from Mali. And I think we ought to ponder and consider just how fortunate we are to be Australians. Thank you for being here tonight to support Page, because we try to support good policy. There's no such thing as a great country to live in, a great society that is not well governed. But the essence of good governance requires high-quality debate and discussion for policy formation if it is to be maintained, and if a society in which people can flourish and take advantage of the opportunities available to them is to be maintained and taken forward. I mention this because we are a research organisation. We try to do some deep thinking about the sort of country that we want to live in. And as I contemplate what's happened in recent times, and as I listen to the public debate, particularly in our publicly funded forums in this country, I wonder whether we haven't lost sight of the foundational underpinnings that have made us such a wonderful society and such a terrific place to live in. In effect, we live in a form of covenantal government. We, the people, take certain rights that belong to us and not to government, but we surrender certain other, if you like, rights. Rights is probably not quite the right word, but we surrender certain things that are better done in the common interest by a common approach, i.e. by government. This is important because, in fact, in our society, government should always be downstream of the people. And we should never forget that, and it is being forgotten. What are the underpinnings? There are four great freedoms, in my view, that are like the four legs of a stout oak table. If you white ant any of them, you weaken all the others. What are those four? The first, being debated in Canberra, but unfortunately I suspect misunderstood by so many people, goes to the heart of individual conscience and freedom of belief. Nothing is more foundational to our identity as people than to have the privilege, the right, and to be able to exercise it, of freedom to believe as we choose and to act in accordance with our conscience. The second great right that we have is freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is the freedom by which we defend all the others, amongst other things. The third is the right to freedom of association and assembly, the right to club together with people that you choose to be with, and yes, to discriminate those that you may not choose to be with at the moment. In this mad progressive world, discrimination is painted as always evil. It is no such thing. There's no such thing. It is a good thing for people to be able to meet in what Edmund Burke called their small platoons and to make their contribution to their own enjoyment of life and to their broader society and to argue their case. And the fourth is property rights, the freedom to call your own home your castle. And no government should have a right to determine what happens and what you think about, provided only that you respect the rights of others in your own home, and anything you might produce, your goods, your services, in a sense, must be chips for you to trade. If you're a humble farmer who grows an extra bale of wool and you make some extra sweaters, you need to know that some authoritarian government is not going to come along and say that's not your property, it's mine, so that you can trade it, otherwise you won't bother. These freedoms are unbelievably important and massively underestimated. We should be prepared to defend them. My father enlisted for the Second World War after the Dunkirk disaster, as so many young country Australians did in 1940, not because he enjoyed war. He was a man who abhorred violence, but it was to almost cost him his life in the Middle Eastern desert as part of the 9th Division in the great pushback against Rommel, one of the first significant battles that started to turn the tide of the war. Why do I mention this? One of the reasons, of course, that he had to go off and fight was that Western culture was starting to express doubt in its own values and beliefs. Hitler turned what should have been nothing more than a series of ugly little border disputes into a global war that killed 60 million people because he thought the West wouldn't stand up for itself. Why not? Because the West was criticising itself. British society was saying we're no good. Communism is a better way to go was one of the lines. There was a famous debate at Oxford. I would not fight for king and country. In other words, I don't believe my culture, the young people, men at Oxford in those days, were saying, is something worth standing up for. What do we say about our culture? Turn on the ABC. We are apparently the most racist, the most sexist, the most bigoted, the most appalling society that you could imagine. And you know who picks it up all the time? If you're not following the news perhaps closely enough, perhaps you should be. The official Chinese news outlets. They hardly have to find their words to criticise us. They pick up our own condemnation, our own loathing of our values and our place in the world. And identity politics is taking us back to the law of the jungle. Hyperpolarisation, where instead of collectively working together, the famous G.K. Chesterton, do you remember? Some of you might see Father Brown on television, and it's inspired by G.K. Chesterton. He was an absolutely brilliant writer and theologian, and he had a unique capacity. He's very charismatic, get on with other people. It's said that he and George Bernard Shaw disagreed on everything but loved one another's company. And Chesterton was 6'3" and enormous. George Bernard Shaw was as skinny as a rake, a little fella. They met up, having not seen one another for 6 months, in London one day, and George said to George Bernard Shaw, G.K. Chesterton said to George Bernard Shaw, "George, you're so thin. You look like there's been a famine in Great Britain." And George Bernard Shaw shot back at him, "And you look, G.K., as though you're the cause of it." But G.K. Chesterton said this: for a society like ours to work, we need to remember what the good book tells us. Whether it's comfortable or not, we're commanded to love our neighbour and our enemy. They're often the same people. But now we just hate, don't we? We talk about competing human rights and all this architecture we put in place, my rights, and I'll defend them against you, rather than cooperate and think together as Australians. We've got to change this. We have to push back. As John Howard was so fond of saying, politics is about ideas. But a free society is a result of great thinking and of great sacrifices and of people who have argued with courage against thoughtlessness and stupidity. And it's in that context, Peter, that I want to really say I'm deeply appreciative you've come tonight. I've known you a long time. Formidable is a good word. I can tell you that this is one former Deputy Prime Minister who used to quake in his boots if he thought he'd offended Peta Credlin. And because she was an advisor in the building for so long, the Defence Minister, the Communications Minister, then the Prime Minister. You are now a columnist with the Australian, the Sunday, the News Limited Sunday papers, Sky. So you all know that. But sorry. Radio as well. recently recognised as an officer in the Order of Australia. But the thing that I would say, my personal remark would be this. When I know Peta Credlin's coming on, I think I can't wait to hear what she's going to say. At the same time, as I have to say to you, I think I wish I could think as clearly and as concisely and as accurately as you do, and I wish I could articulate as well as you do. Peta, it's a genuine privilege to have you with us, and I invite you up now.
Well, I'm just going to give you a tip. It's a long speech, it's a lecture, so get yourselves a glass of wine and settle in. I don't want you to be unprepared at all. Let me start by acknowledging your standard bearers, some of which, or many of which are with us tonight and have served in the Parliament in particular. Our country at the highest level. To you, John Anderson, Leader of the National Party, former Leader of the National Party, former Deputy Prime Minister, and now Chair in all your spare time, which is not a lot because you're a podcast international guru. I get sent notes from Canada and elsewhere that I must listen to your latest podcast. Thank you for those kind remarks, and thank you for all you still do for the party, for the coalition, all these years after your time in office. To Peter Walsh, you've got a big job ahead of you, but thank you for being here. Federal Cabinet Minister, Senator the Honourable Bridget McKenzie, thank you. You've had a big week. Good to have you here. Queensland's favourite son, Matt Canavan, who did Credlin's show tonight. Thank you as well. Assistant Minister and now soon to retire member for Nichols, Damien Drum. Thank you for being here tonight. The member for Mallee, Dr. Anne Webster. Good to see you as well. And Melina Barth, whom I don't know, but I'm told is in the room.
She's the best one out of all of them.
Ah, there you go. Nice to meet you too, Melina. Friends and supporters of the National Party, one and all. I've got to look down, I'm afraid, because I've got written remarks so I can cover everything. When John Anderson approached me and asked me if I would do this lecture, I was honoured, because I think it's a very significant time in our electoral cycle for all of those MPs other than Damien Drum that I've just mentioned. Significant time for them, all about to face the ballot box in the federal parliament context, but also here in Victoria. And it's also a way for me to pay tribute to a political movement that's represented regional Australia for over 100 years, while helping to keep coalition governments honest. All of my political life, I have worked alongside Nationals. And as a conservative Liberal, I consider them family. Partly, I suspect, that's a bit of nostalgia, for the days when Warren Truss and Barnaby Joyce stood beside Tony Abbott in those incredibly tough opposition years after 2007. Your former President, Christine Ferguson, as well, and I understand she's here as well with us tonight. When my husband, Brian Lockdane, then the Liberal Party's federal director, worked hand in glove with your federal campaign chiefs, Andrew Hall, Brad Henderson, and of course Scott Mitchell. And I pay tribute to Brian's deputy, Julian Sheasel, who's here tonight as well, and your federal campaign leader, Jonathan Hawkes, who I just spoke to briefly before. But I also consider the Nats family because I was given extraordinary support and wise counsel from the late and great David Whitrow, a long-time servant of your party and someone who I remember tonight amongst his friends and the party he loved with all of his heart. But most of all, I was born and bred in the seat of Mallee. I feel an affinity with the National Party, a seat that you have held since its inception, and the place that my family has called home since the early 1870s. Indeed, until my mum left Witchyproof 2 years ago, that's the first time there hasn't been a Credlin there for 6 generations. My mum's side of the family are from Tatura, which is also a National Party seat. So I don't know how I ended up on the Liberal side of the fence, but there you go. And this... and yeah, well... meaning that I think as a Conservative Liberal and the National Party that the values, the people, the concerns that you represent are familiar to me, indeed shared by me, and that's why I'm honoured to be here tonight. Now, this is the first time I understand that they've done the lecture with a dinner, and I think it's really fitting after a whole 2 years of not being able to meet together that we are all in the room. Who would have thought we'd come to cherish something as simple as going out for a meal together and someone else doing the dishes? Or the sun in our face going for a walk without a mask. But such is the impact of COVID over the past 2 years, not just in our economic and cultural life, but on our liberties as well and our political life, but I'll get to those in a moment. We shouldn't doubt that the Right Honourable Dr. Sir Earl Page would have taken the last couple of years in his stride, because he lived through 2 world wars and the Spanish flu, which took around 50 million lives. Indeed, his time as a field surgeon in the Great War and the horrors he would have witnessed would have helped bring some much-needed perspective to some of our pandemic decision-making. I can't see a politician who went through all of that then deciding to shut down children's playgrounds. But that just serves as yet another reminder to us all the continuing need to have the broadest range of experience in our parliamentarians. And Page was an extraordinary man, even for an age of extraordinary leaders. He exemplified the power of education to transform lives, something the Coalition profoundly believes in, something I believe in. Back in the Mallee, my dad left school at the age of 12. Not extraordinary for a country town like Witchyproof, but something you don't hear people mention, I think, enough in life about the challenges of regional Australia. When Page entered university at the age of 15, and he relied on scholarships throughout his education. He graduated with 2 degrees in medicine and surgery by the age of 21. When he was a young man, the Sydney Harbour was full of sailing ships for work, not pleasure, and land transport was by horse or steam train. By the time of his last election in 1961, the Australian middle class had access to telephones and TVs and motor cars, and the era of jet travel was just beginning. Beyond war and pandemic, he had lived through the Great Depression too, all part of the full, well-lived life he brought to Canberra, and he served in the Bruce, Lyons, Fadden and Menzies governments. He was briefly our 11th Australian Prime Minister, and for 18 years, the National Party leader. He outlasted 5 deputies. That's never an easy feat in Canberra, is it? 5 deputies. Throughout all of this, his support for the fundamental values of the centre-right side of politics was steadfast. By contrast, we are living through a time of incredible prosperity and hitherto unparalleled peace, but an era where our values and attitudes have changed, and that's what I want to focus on tonight. What would Earl Page have made of the climate wars, attacks on free speech, historical revisionism, our gender battles and magic pudding economics, where we're fast living beyond our means as individuals and a nation? As one of the first people in northern New South Wales to own a motor car and one of the first medical practitioners in Australia to provide x-rays, and as the co-owner of Grafton's newspaper, I'm sure he would have coped perfectly well with smartphones and social media, but it would have been cultural change rather than technological change that would most likely have had him shaking his head and muttering the world had lost its bearings. He was, of course, a very early advocate for hydroelectric power because he saw it as so much cheaper than coal after the capital investment, not because he was worried about carbon dioxide. Keenly focused as he was on the big industrial capability of Australia and wanting to develop that. A frontier sort of mindset fashioned after seeing so many lives wasted by war and depression, he was determined not to squander the blessings of this country. Like generations of country and then National Party MPs, Page was more than ready to step in where pure market forces would have been unfair to his constituents. Intellectual purity, he would have thought, needs to be tempered by practical wisdom and pragmatism. But as all successful leaders know, at some point buying off pressure groups stops being mending the social fabric and starts to become unprincipled opportunism or lack of political courage by those who should speak up and defend Australia's fundamental freedoms and values, but don't. Can I trouble someone for a handkerchief? Because I have got a really runny nose. Sorry, I've got to take a handkerchief. Thank you. A lecture such as this is the chance to reassert what we believe in on the centre right, our preference for individual freedom, respect for taxpayers and pride in our country, which has been our mainstay, and keeping the faith with those who have come before us. Would Earl Page be able to walk into the room tonight and recognise what the National Party stands for today? In my case, would Sir Robert Menzies, who, let's not forget, towards the end of his life, was so disillusioned with the party and what he felt it had become that he reportedly voted DLP. If they want to be relevant, political parties must be electable, because there's not a lot you can do in opposition. But if they want to make a difference once they're elected, parties need values and instincts on which policy is based, not just announcements that spend taxpayer dollars. If they've got to want to be credible over time, they need broad consistency in what they say and what they do. The current federal government was elected promising strong borders, sound budgets, and an end to Labor's jobs-destroying emissions obsession. Of the coalition partners, arguably, it's the National Party which has most kept the government on track and honest with what it was elected to do in 2013. The most recent and significant example of this is the debate about Australia's Glasgow commitments of net zero by 2050. Of course, the Conservative in me, think of the word conservative, conserve, we own that. We give it up too much to the progressive left, but we own that word conservative and conserve. The Conservative in me wants to rest lightly on the planet. But the same Conservative in me rejects socialism and wealth redistribution and meaningless gestures, ever bigger government and empty political posturing. Which is why, as someone from a blue-collar, small business, regional family, I reject the climate agenda to deindustrialise this country, ship our jobs overseas, as readily as we'll keep shipping our natural resources for someone else to use and grow their economy and their jobs and their prosperity and emissions while we make ourselves poorer here at home. I admire the Nationals for publicly resisting pressure to just roll over on emissions targets and for demanding that any policy that hits their communities should be and must be subject to rigorous costing. Like many of you, I want to see emissions come down as far and as fast as possible, and I hope, Prime Minister's right, I hope he's right, that technology will make net zero achievable without a hair shirt in sight. But I would not, and I do not, put cutting emissions ahead of protecting jobs and our standard of living, especially since Australia or even the West on its own can't make much difference to total global emissions. And those that can, like China, responsible for over a third of all of our emissions, is only growing its energy use and its economic strength, as well as its military, at a time when climate activists want us to smother ours. This is where we have been an honest coalition, where Libs and Nats work alongside each other but rightly have their own identities. As I often needed to remind some senior Liberals, the Nats are their own party. They're not a sub-faction of the Liberal Party. And a bit of product differentiation is a good thing for them and for us. The smarter ones got it. They're not all smart. In any event, it's at least a coalition where things are out in the open. Unlike the coalition on the left, between Labor and the Greens, where they consistently vote in a block, in government and opposition, and around 80% of Green preferences flow back in a very disciplined way to the ALP. Something I think the campaign strategists here and in Canberra must exploit more come election time. Of course, beyond everything else on the political agenda, the biggest challenge in recent years has been the one we were not expecting, the virus out of Wuhan that's challenged not just governments, but our families and us as individuals too. Nearly all governments have struggled with the pandemic. It's been especially difficult for governments on the centre-right that are instinctively uncomfortable with lockdowns that experts have demanded and the vast social spending the closing businesses has necessitated. The lockdown frustration of many instinctive conservatives is one of the reasons for today's breakouts on the right. The cashed up and revitalised Palmer Party, the revived Lib Dems, and since its launch last Friday here in Victoria, the Victoria Party, along with One Nation, all of which threaten to splinter the centre-right vote and make the re-election of the Morrison government so much harder. To say nothing of the raft of so-called independents, the voices of this or the voices of that, which seem to target coalition-only held seats, betraying their real agenda. Getting the balance right between minimising harm and maximising freedom under the pressure of the pandemic was never going to be easy. Still, it will be important in the run-up to the election for the coalition to reassure its base that it hasn't lost faith in personal freedom, in individual choice, in keeping government spending down so that taxes are as low as possible and people can keep more of what they work so hard to earn. At least the Prime Minister has finally started to call out the Labor premiers for their continued border closures and insistence on a form of vaccine apartheid for unvaccinated people. Not only deny the chance to sit in a cafe, but work as well. And it's critical with the emergence of this new variant that we keep calm and carry on, because new variants will keep coming. But with the world's best vaccination rates, they'll distract us, but they shouldn't derail us. I wish that everyone would get vaccinated. I've been fully vaccinated since June. But in a free society, people have the right to choose. Indeed, they've got the right to be wrong. And the last thing we need, on top of the million or so working-age people in this country who don't work and won't work, is another 500,000 people who want to work but can't work because they haven't been jabbed. Forcing them onto the dole is bad for the budget and bad for society, because there is dignity in work. And the growth of our welfare state since Page's day is something we should want to arrest, not encourage. Particularly, and this was on my show tonight, given our $1 trillion post-COVID debt, $1.3 trillion, $34 billion in interest payments alone per annum. It's 34 teaching hospitals, 34 big metropolitan hospitals right around the country every single year with that $34 billion. That's what it costs in interest alone. In 30 years' time, we will go from a country with 7 taxpayers per retiree to just 4 taxpayers per retiree. And it will be through their diminishing taxes that we will all expect our standard of living to be continued and funded. Education, NDIS, money for this, money for that. We've been on the drip feed for far too long. But that's what we'll expect, but we won't have the taxpayer base. Beyond the nation's balance sheet, though, it's our character that's most under siege. sometimes internally, but from our opponents, particularly those like Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews, who doesn't just espouse ideology, doesn't just push a barrow that diminishes the role of family in the society and faith in our communities, but he legislates his hard agenda. He doesn't waste a moment in government. And he establishes, therefore, a template like pattern legislation that all of his like-minded state allies will then implement in their own jurisdictions. Now, like me, I'm sure you've been supporting the Federal Education Minister as he exposes this new proposed draft school curriculum, politically correct, cultural Marxism. Dr. Donnelly's called that out many times. It's brainwashing for kids. 2-year-olds don't have to learn their times table, but they have to be able to pick out pictures of racism, even though no country is fairer to minorities than ours. Rightly, Minister Tudge has identified the school curriculum not just as an education portfolio issue, but one of national security too. After all, what student today will want to defend our flag and our country if it comes to that, with the big dragon to our north, if their entire school experience has been one of indoctrinated shame? But it's an area where the minister's alarm bell ringing has got to be backed up with action, not just hand-wringing. If COVID has a silver lining, there's millions of mums and dads out there with 2 years of homeschooling under their belt, understanding better than ever what their children are being taught and what they're not being taught. Beyond our international rankings, which have fallen off a cliff, this lived experience should deliver the Coalition a ready constituency if only they were brave enough to do more than just talk. Similarly, the very difficult issues of gender and race. Difficult now, of course, but not always so difficult. Not difficult when Martin Luther King implored us to set aside everything else and instead just focus on the content of our characters. Yet now, all we see is difference. How denying women and girls their rightful place in sporting teams for women and girls is somehow progress is beyond me. And don't even get me started on terms like pregnant people as opposed to pregnant women that appeared in a recent Commonwealth government medical guide, and chest feeding. I have ministers' numbers and I can tell you I bloody well use them at 11:30 at night when that stuff hits the papers. This, under a coalition government no less, shows how deep the claws of activists have got into institutions and our nation's soul. Good on the retiring Greg Hunt. When I sent him a message, that was gone within 2 days. Good on Greg Hunt. As someone who has spent 16 years in Canberra, working for ministers and party leaders in the hard years of opposition, I might add, I first hired this one over there, Matt Canavan. I know how hard government is. There's so much you'd like to do, but you can't. The circumstances aren't right, the numbers aren't with you. Like when the Abbott government got a mandate at its election in 2013 to repeal the free speech sapping 18C. But when it went into the party room, the moderates who won their seats on that mandate wouldn't back it. National Party did, Conservative Liberals did, but the moderates who owed their win to Abbott refused to back it. And all but one of the Liberal premiers were against it. So you can't change everything at once, but at any one time, there has to be something you're trying to change. You can't fight on every front, but there always has to be a fight. Otherwise, what's the point of electing the coalition over Labor? I've always thought our side of politics stands for 4 things: belief in individual freedom, respect for the social fabric, respect for the money we hold on trust from taxpayers, and a fierce pride in our country. The challenge is to work out for our particular time what specifically needs to be done in order to make our country freer, fairer and stronger, and then strive to make that happen. Back in 2013, the Coalition had a thumping win because we had a really clear program. So clear, in fact, the journos could repeat it back to the then opposition leader. Stop the boats, strap the tax, roads the 21st century, and get the budget back under control. Over and over and over and over and over again. And they got in and they did all of those things. Even John Howard thought it would be impossible to stop the boats, but they were stopped within 3 months. Carbon tax, mining tax repealed. Big roads, WestConnex, other roads in Sydney, Pacific Highway, the Bruce Highway, and the Western Sydney Airport that no one could make a decision on for nearly 45 years. The 2014 budget was the last serious attempt we had at a country to live within our means and to put the brakes on Labor's baked-in spending in education and health. We had tax papers, Federation white papers. If they hadn't been dropped by the intervening Prime Minister, there would have been an ongoing process of change for the better, less of this chronic blame game between the states and the federal government, which we've all seen, particularly in the COVID context in the last 2 years. Thankfully, defence spending was significantly increased, naval acquisition started, otherwise I fear we'd be in an even worse position than we are now with a threat to our north. Now, I love political campaigns. I would say I've been a veteran campaigner. And I admire the way that Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg hounded Bill Shorten at the last election over the retirees tax, the hit on mum and dad investors. Even though I think Matt Canavan's solo campaign on the Adani mine and Labor's insistence on an uncosted climate plan probably actually won us the election, if you look at where the swings were. Just as Barnaby Joyce's barnstorming in 2016 saved the Turnbull government. But I doubt you can win 2 elections running on the basis that the opposition would be worse, especially when Anthony Albanese will not repeat the big target strategy of his predecessor. So seeking a 4th term with no seats to spare, in fact, retirements aside, 5 down, the heavy losses of good people going, the redistributions against the government this time will actually have to tell us what it is for as well as what it's against. One of the Coalition's best strategists has always said to me there are 4 basic themes on which elections invariably turn. 4 themes: new hope, it's time, more to do, and the others would be worse. With the it's time factor going against us, don't underestimate how me too Labor will be on policy substance. On substance as opposed to delivery, but on substance. Hence the plausibility gap for a mostly negative Coalition campaign, particularly if there's patchy economic recovery or a hangover of restrictions from the pandemic. The Howard government first won in 96 based on new hope. In 98 and 2001, it was more to do on tax and then on border protection. It was really only in 2004, that was the Latham election, if you'll remember that one, that its main pitch had become that Labor would be worse. And that didn't work the next time in 2007, when a leader pitched himself as Howard Light. Kevin 07, Economic Conservative Queensland, I'm here to help. You know the pitch. Now, taxes will always be higher and spending will always be greater and regulation always more intrusive under a Labor government. In their habitual search for more victims, Labor can't help but sap our national self-confidence. But because Albanese won't stress any of this, there will have to be a more-to-do agenda from the Morrison government. Maybe it's back to basics on the curriculum. Maybe it's a civil nuclear power program. By God, I would hope Someone has the gumption for that one. Maybe it's shifting all the ABC head offices out to regional Victoria. Maybe it's restarting immigration at a lower level, a more sustainable level. You know, every poll the last 30 years has Greens, Labor, Liberal and National Party wanting immigration but at sustainable levels, and no one in Canberra listens. Be brave enough to take that issue on. Not saying no immigration, just at a sustainable level, and you would win the war. Whatever it is, it's got to be a proactive agenda, not just mind the shop, as Thatcher would say. We can't be a coalition that thinks the best we have to offer the Australian people is just a slower slide to the left than offered by our opponents. Because when we roll over on big issues because we think the fight is over, rather than stand and be prepared to tackle them from the instinctual middle ground, Australians lose heart in us, because the middle ground is where most Australians sit. If you listen to the media and the loudest voices in the public square, it's easy enough to think and feel that you are in the minority. But we are not in the minority. Look at the last 9 federal elections. Labor has won a majority only once. 9 elections, 1 majority, 2007, which tells you in unequivocal, fact-based terms where the majority of Australians are. So why are we so reluctant to defend who we are and what we stand for? And why are we so naive that we don't recognise how under siege we really are? Too often as Conservatives, we fall into the trap of thinking that good people will eventually be mugged by the reality of life and come over to us or return to us. But it's no longer like that. The left have strategically played a long game, seeping into our institutions, into the curriculum, even into the very language we're now allowed to use. They're often more motivated than us. They're certainly angrier, far bigger haters than us. They're better organised and far better funded. But we are right. We are right. We are right, and we are good, and we are decent. We believe our country's best years are ahead of it, while we respect the past and those who have gone before us. And we believe in the dignity of all Australians, regardless of the job they do, what they wear to work, if they work inside the home or outside the home, or the postcode where they live. Our challenge as coalitionists, as Liberals and Nationals, is not actually for ordinary Australians to believe in us. More than often, it's for us to believe in ourselves. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I know it's probably not allowed to say, but we'll say it anyway in here. Merry Christmas, not happy holidays. Merry Christmas and all the best for those facing office next year.
Thank you, Peter. I'll just invite Senator Bridget Mackenzie up here to give the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Wrong side. Well, how lucky are we tonight? What a great way to end a sitting week. Thank you so much, Peta Credlin. Peter Walsh, John Anderson, MPs, Drummy, Anne, Maddie, my Deputy Leader in the Senate, and Melina Barr. Thank you for your powerful presentation and reminder to all of us why we believe the things we believe, why we must stand courageous in the face of difference and dissent and attack, powerful attack as we've been experiencing, particularly at a federal level this year. You've earned a very sincere vote of thanks from us here tonight, and though Peter is a die-hard Liberal, you can take the girl out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the girl. And we'll have you any day in our team. At the risk of making our guest of honour a little cross, I just want to add a few little extra things about Peta. She's an enormously capable woman. From her early career as a lawyer, her consummate skills as Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, formidable Sky News interrogator, and how thankful we are that that's on free to air in the regions. ABC ratings are bombed. And she's renowned amongst family and friend as being an awesome cook. But beyond that, Peta has demonstrated tremendous leadership trait. Leadership from behind, leadership by example, and most importantly, leading when your colleagues or team don't always see the path ahead as clearly as you do. Peta was right about our little party's contribution to the national debate over the last century as a party of values in Australia's political system. We represent the least affluent people in this country, who ironically produce all the wealth of our nation. We represent the values of hard-working men and women who are the backbone, the farmers, the fishers, the foresters, the miners, the manufacturers, the small businesses, the Defence Force. Peta, we represent the people, as you know, who are very proud of their nation, who are the patriots. And I don't think that anyone in this room wants to be sleepwalking into a situation, which I think we are, where young people are growing up ashamed of Australia. They're being taught that we are not a country to be proud of when we are. So we should place great value on the power and influence, I think, as a political party of values that we have, that we're privileged as those National Party MPs, particularly in Canberra, and we should use that power judiciously, and we should never be afraid of using that. The man for whom this lecture and organisation is named, Earl Page, was the great architect of the coalition, the most successful political partnership in Australia's history. What our two parties have delivered for this country in over nearly 80 years is phenomenal, and it's only ever been under threat 5 times. But it is a relationship that is based on mutual trust and really only gets in difficulty when there's a level of disrespect. And I think, Peta, when you remind people that we are a separate political party with our own set of values, our own heritage, our own sense of what the future likes and our own constituency, that is sometimes forgotten. I think this year we had a conversation at a federal level on net zero. And at the time, it looked a little messy, I might suggest, from the outside, but it was absolutely about ensuring the second party of this government had a say and ensure that the people we were sent to Canberra to represent were protected in any move by the Prime Minister to sign us up to an emissions goal target trajectory. Because let's just cast our minds back here. That kilt was packed, the document was drafted, we were heading to Glasgow, and no one had had a conversation with the National Party. And given who we represent, given our set of values, given the number of elections, and Peter, you referenced Matt's work in Central Queensland at the last election, given the type of conversation our party had been having in over a decade, I still find it incredible that we got to that point. And it was the National Party that said, hang on, soldier, we've got a few things we want to say about this. And they were not easy conversations. We had the Treasurer, a good friend of mine, but he was out there warning about international finance abandoning us. It was like a full-on campaign. Started with Josh on the international financing warning. Then we had our traditional allies, the NFF, coming out. Next day it was the Minerals Council. The next day it was the Business Council. We had all the media, including News Corp, backflipping on this. We had, our alliance partners, our Five Eyes partners. Biden-led US, Boris has led UK, little old New Zealand. The National Party looked around and you know what? We're the only game in town that still thought this had hairs on it. And the only reason we had to think very clearly, what were we sent to Canberra to do? We have one job, and it's to make sure the people that we represent are better off after we leave than they are today. And through that whole debate, those couple of weeks, it was our party that was thinking about the impact of this policy in 3 decades. Everyone else was just thinking about how to get through the next election. That is what a party of values actually does. And I'm very proud that our party came to a position because, in a respectful manner, we are a party with net zero never, with people in our party room who couldn't wait to sign the pledge, and a whole lot of people in the middle. And because of our intervention, the plan that got taken to Glasgow has safeguards for our industries, ensures that we're not signing up to methane, ensures we've got a review for long after. I hope the coalition's in power until 2050. It probably won't be. So putting those measurements in over time to ensure that this policy, as it rolls out, the regions will be actually front and centre. I think your comments on premiers were spot on. I think Victorians have realised what our diggers were fighting for in those 2 world wars. Freedom has suddenly become a thing again because it's been taken away. And I think it's incredibly important that we don't lose that. On the emissions, humans have been getting themselves out of troubled spots through technology, since we first stumbled across fire. And we're going to do the same thing with emissions. Rural and regional Australians, like Peta said, she wants to tread lightly on this earth. We want to be good stewards of this earth. And regional people, we live in the natural environment. We rely on the natural elements to raise our families and make a living. We were conservationists before the environment was weaponised for the leftist ideology, way before. And we need to, I think, remember to be proud of who we are, what we believe, where we come from and what we do out there in the regions. And that, I think, is what the National Party brings to the political debate. And we can't be part of the government without being in partnership with the Liberals. And like any relationship, has to be respectful, loving and communicative. I think there's a lot of debate about this upcoming election. Is it going to be the 2004 version or the 2007? Well, I'm doing everything I can to make sure it's 2004 outcome, including praying. And in this room, I'm not ashamed to say that, John, I think the religious discrimination piece is spot on. Faith-filled Australians voted for us. We made a commitment. And the moderate Liberals who are holding us to ransom after winning their seat and winning government on the back of pledges like a Religious Discrimination Act and other pledges we made as a government in that election. You don't get to pick and choose when you win government about which election commitments you want to keep and which ones you're happy to go through to the keeper. And for those moderates to be holding our government and nation to ransom, I think has to be dealt with, and I hope that happens over the holidays. We're going to be doing everything we can to unite as a coalition, particularly after this week. Punch on, because our country deserves our 2 parties for a brighter future. So thank you, Peta, for your patriotism. Thank you for articulating always so clearly the importance of conservative values. Thank you for being a woman of action, unapologetic, a change agent and a great country girl. Enjoy your night.